Right, so, picking up from where I left off, I'd been fired from my place of work in Toronto. I was just hanging about in my accommodation, nothing doing for the most part. I was just hanging around, contemplating whether I should fly back home or if I should just wait until my lease expires. So then I'd have to start making arrangements to go back to the hostel again. It was an upsetting period of time for me, although looking back, I'd say it was also a necessary experience because it taught me that you can't always, you have to be careful sometimes with who you share personal information with and what you say to the right person. Anyway, that's more or less the positive spin, perhaps the only positive spin I could put on that experience. So I spent a lot of time brooding in misery, and I was upset and thinking I might have to fly back home and cut my trip short and end it early. However, it seemed that luck was on my side. See, when I said earlier that I had no family or relatives in Canada, that was true. However, we had a distant friend of a family relative who did live in South Ontario. I think her name was Angela. It's hard for me to remember these names because this was many years ago. But anyway, I had a family friend, a distant family friend who I don't think I'd ever met before, who lived, I think, a couple hundred miles or so further up north in southern Ontario, who worked at a tourist resort. And my family did some networking on my behalf and asked to see if maybe it was possible that I could be offered a job up there. Now, this was not something that I'd actually planned on. The entire time when I went to Canada, I pretty much went in there blind, totally blind to the challenges that I'd be facing. I kind of just thought I'd take whatever opportunity comes my way and go wherever fate takes me, I guess. That was my attitude. It was pretty naive and optimistic looking back. I think a smarter strategy probably would have been going somewhere where we actually had family connections, because if there's one thing that I learned by this time, and this is a general truth of life, by the way, no matter what you do, no matter where you foray into, this old adage, it's something that you need to understand and commit to memory. Basically, it's never what you know, it's who you know. If you want to succeed in any industry, and it doesn't matter whether it ranges from acting or music or the world of business, you need to know somebody on the inside who can introduce you to the other people to let you in the club. Because a lot of these, again, well, I'm talking about this in terms of if you want to succeed, but actually the old truth that it's who you know, not what you know, it basically applies to everything. Not just if you want to succeed, but if you want to work somewhere, it always helps if you happen to know somebody who already works there, because then they can introduce you. Because you see, as humans, I think we don't really we all have our little prejudices and our what's the best way I can put this? See, when it comes to applicants, we're more inclined, and this doesn't matter whether you're looking for candidates for a job or if you're taking part in a voice acting project and you're looking for people to take part in your project. And I myself have done this, so I've learned from experience that this is true. you're more likely to go for people who you already know or who other people have recommended to you. And in pretty much in the same way in the last video I told you about the date I went on. How did that happen? How did it come about? Well, it was because I met someone who introduced me to Maria. Now, sadly, that didn't come to anything. But it's interesting to think, you know, if I hadn't met her, the date wouldn't have happened. And even going back further, that elderly gentleman, that elderly Cajun chap from the United States, if I hadn't had a chance encounter with him, he wouldn't have hooked me up with his contact in Kensington Market, who happened to have a leasehold on a place where I could sign up and live. And if none of those encounters had happened, my trip in Canada probably would have ended a whole lot earlier. But yeah, basically, if you want to succeed or if you want to survive, you got to know the right people. Anyway, never was this lesson more apparent to me. I think this was the time when I began to realize that this is actually a pretty important fundamental truth of life, and I would do well to understand and respect it. Never was this more true to me than this particular moment, when my family, you know, who were always concerned and worried about me, they decided to pull some strings and speak with Angela, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon after that, I got a FaceTime call. Was it a FaceTime call, or was it was probably a FaceTime call from the woman who ran the tourist resort in question. And she was a very lovely lady. I think her name was Alison. And she was the head of guest services. No, she was the guest services director of the resort. We had a brief chat. It might have been an hour or less. I forget how long the chat was. But she basically all but offered me the job. And now that this had happened, now that I had basically not only a place to work, but also a place to stay, because that's another thing. Because I would be working on site at the resort, they also had lodgings and accommodations for service personnel over there too. So just like that, not only did I have a job, but I also had a place to stay. And it wasn't in Toronto, but it was a place a little bit further up north. So I got to do a little bit of exploring. It's funny to think, you know, the entire time I stayed in Canada for the 9 or 10 months, I was originally hoping to go exploring pretty much all over the country, but my material circumstances made that impossible. And this was long before I learned to drive anyhow. So, and as I learned the hard way, in a place like Canada or the United States, it's not impossible to get to where you want to go if you don't have a car. If you don't have a car, your next best bet is to either use an airplane or a Greyhound bus, or in some cases the Amtrak. But trains over there are a lot slower than they are over here. So basically, you gotta use the road. You gotta use the highway. And luckily, there was a Greyhound bus from Toronto bus station that took me to Collingwood. Now I think this was only 100 miles further up north, which sounds like a very long distance, but if you actually look on Google Maps and check out the difference between Collingwood and Toronto, it's not even a finger's breadth worth of distance. Like, you're still in South Ontario. There's hundreds, if not thousands of miles worth of expanse and Arctic wilderness that's beyond that, where really only the First Reservations people, the Inuits and the Micmacs live. But anyway, I got to do a little bit of exploring, and my appetite for adventure had been rekindled. So with hope in my heart, I boarded the bus up to Collingwood. I'd basically already been offered the job at this point, because as I've said, you know, we're we're a very pro-social species, and it pays to know the right people, even if by accident. And drawing from this one experience, I think what this has come to make me realize is, I think the most successful people in the world and the most content are the ones who are very socially skilled. The ones who know not just the most amount of people, but who know all the right people and who have the social skills, who are mentally well adjusted enough to meet the most amount of people and get the most out of life. I think my dad was like that. Well, my dad wasn't hugely successful, but he was very enterprising and motivated. He was way better at conversation and meeting other people than I was, that's for darn sure. And for reasons unbeknownst to me, for whatever reason, I just never really inherited these things from him. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. So, when I first arrived and got off at Collingwood bus station, what was the town like? Well, it's a very small town, but there's a difference between small towns in the New World, so small towns in places like America and Canada, than small towns over here. Because Britain is a small island. I think in terms of geographic landmass, it's smaller than the state of California, yet it's far more densely populated. There's nearly 70 million people who live here in total. Also, our history dates much further back than New World cities and New World towns. So our towns, cities, hamlets, and metropolitan areas are designed a lot differently. To that end, they're far more efficient, they're far more densely packed. They're designed in a way that's more organic and that's more accommodating of there being lots of people living in a smaller space. And as I talked about in part 2 of this video series, it was interesting for me to note the differences in how New World cities like Toronto, New York, etc. are designed, because a lot of them are designed like a grid. And there are advantages that come with designing places like that in sense that they're easier to navigate, but they're less efficient. And also because these cities are larger, it's physically more exhausting to walk from one area to the next. That's why you need a car. You need a car, and you don't really need a car as much in a place like Britain, anywhere in the UK, because a lot of the main central hubs and the main sort of cities and population hubs, you can pretty much get to where you need to go through public transport. Not that that's a positive experience, mind, and I could make a whole rant on how bad our public transportation is, but basically a small town, especially in England, it is exactly that, a small town. You don't need a car to go from one town to the next. In a lot of cases, you can just simply walk maybe a mile, 2 miles at the most before you arrive at the next one. And basically all the things that you need, all your basic necessities, are within a relatively short walk away. But that's not the case in a place like Canada. And in Collingwood, for instance, Collingwood is a typical example of one of these small towns, because the roads are much more wide, which is, it's more efficient. For instance, it's more effective if you own a car and if you drive regularly. But if you walk, it means more walking distance to get from one side of the road to the other. There's I don't remember if the sidewalks, if they have good enough facilities for pedestrians, like if you want to walk. But basically, it's very difficult to get where you need to go just by walking in Collingwood, and it takes a far greater time to walk around. And that was pretty much my experience. That being the case, though, it was still very fun and very novel, even though it meant walking much longer distances. There was still lots of fun and cool things to do. One of the places that I spent the most amount of time when I went out shopping, which I had to do entirely by walking, by the way, although if I was lucky, occasionally I'd be offered a lift by people who lived and worked there. Because that's another thing. Hitchhiking is more common in places like in America and in Canada than it is around here, because it's kind of necessary if you don't have a car. It's deeply embedded. I think hitchhiking is it's an entirely North American thing. I don't know if hitchhiking's that much of a thing around here. Anyway, if you wanted to do things like food shopping, or if you just wanted to grab a bite to eat or go shopping for clothes, the place where you would go is this little thing that they call a strip mall. And I think in the UK, our equivalent is probably something like a retail park. A strip mall is basically a giant car park with shops attached to it. And that's where I would often go. I'm trying to think, what were the shops that I would go shopping at most often? There was a grocery shop that had a name that was really similar to Tesco, but that was basically where I went to get snacks and food. Then there was a Chinese buffet restaurant. I had such a great time there. It was pretty expensive, but the great thing about it being a buffet is that you pay a flat fee and you get to have as much food as you want. I had some really fun memories of that place. So yeah, living in Collingwood, it meant a lot of walking, but it also meant I got to do a lot of sightseeing. And I certainly got my fair dose of exercise. I got the cardio, that's for darn sure. Anyway, so now that I was settled in my new place of Collingwood, I was given a place to stay on staff accommodation, and there were these little satellite houses that were positioned around the perimeter, the periphery of the resort. So Living Water Resort, it wasn't a huge resort. It was a very nice place to stay, but it was a stopping destination for people who wanted to go to the Blue Mountain Ski Resort, which was another tourist resort that was a little further up north. And if you wanted to go there, which is, chances are, the only reason you were in Collingwood in the first place is because you wanted to go to the Blue Mountains, you would probably stop at a place like Collingwood in the Living Water in the first place. And we still got plenty of customers a lot of the time, because it's a very nice place. They had lots of good food. The rooms were immaculate. You know, pretty much what you'd expect from any 4-star hotel. Obviously, I didn't have the budget to spend a single night in any one of them, but I was getting paid, I think, $15 an hour, which is better than nothing. So the job, the place where I was living with 3 other people. One of them was Mexican. Interesting side note, there were a lot of Mexicans I remember meeting in in Canada, not just Toronto, but in Collingwood too. And it actually made me curious, because I thought, if anything, the place where you'd be most likely to find Mexicans would be in America, in the United States, because that's where the border is. But no, for some reason, there's a lot of Mexicans living in Canada too. And I puzzled over this. I remember thinking, what the hell happened? Did these guys jump so high over the Rio Grande that they overshot their target and ended up north of the United States? Is that what happened? Anyway, I don't really have any complaint or problem with the Mexicans, because all the Mexicans that I met there, they were very polite, they were very friendly, and one thing I'll credit Mexicans for is their food is absolutely delicious. I understand there are issues with the fact that there's probably too many Mexicans living in some areas of the United States and in Canada, and this is bringing in a whole host of other problems like gun crime, drugs, cartels, and things like that. And then there's the issue with the language barrier, the culture, and at the end of the day, they're a different people, they're a different race. And as a general rule, I think it is best that we keep different peoples confined to different areas. You know, we shouldn't be encouraging mass migration of one particular people into any other group, because that causes conflict and chaos. But anyway, I treat people as individuals, and on an individual level, I found all the Mexicans very decent people. Normal Canadians, though, on the other hand, you see, there's this stereotype about Canadians, that Canadians are always friendly, they're always polite. And looking back, I would say they're definitely polite, but I don't know if I'd say that they're friendly. You know, they won't go up to you and call you or a but if you become more adept at reading and decoding body language, or certainly if you have the experiences like the ones that I've had, you'll know that they can be just as hostile, rude, and hateful as people in any other country. But the difference is obviously the accent. Speaking of which, there is actually, I learned this, there's a subtle difference between how Canadians talk and how Americans talk. So you probably, you know, we get a lot of exposure to American cartoons and American media. You know, the way Americans talk, it's pretty simple, you know. There's a lot of eroticism. The way they pronounce certain things is... I've watched and seen a lot of people do it, so it's pretty easy to imitate. But Canadians, it's similar to American, but there are differences, and the main differences are how they pronounce words, diphthongs like O and U. So for and also there are certain words. I'm trying to think of an example. So I was living in a house in Ontario, in Collingwood, and I discovered to my chagrin that not a lot of people were that friendly or forthcoming, eh? Now that last thing's a stereotype. Canadians don't end their sentences with a. That's well, none of the ones that I met, none of them ever did that. But yeah, there's some truth to stereotypes. If you've heard Jordan Peterson, he's a good example of what a lot of Canadians sound like. But you know, the weird thing is, though, I feel like younger people nowadays in Canada sound more identical to how young people in America do. The differences between Canadians and Americans in terms of how they talk are beginning to get smaller and smaller. And this is a thing that this one YouTuber whose videos I watch, called JJ McCulloch, this is something that he's picked up on. But for the elderly people, you know, people in their 50s or 60s, boomers, they're more noticeable. Alright, so anyway, who are my flatmates? Who are the people I was living with? Well, one of them was a Mexican woman, and I can't really remember her name. All I remember about her is that she was very kind, and I didn't have any problems with her. But there was one guy and his girlfriend. I think the man's name was Jamie, and he worked in sales. He had a bit of an attitude problem. And then his girlfriend, I could only describe his girlfriend, Meg, by the way, as a stereotypical middle-class white girl. She listened to rap music. No, I mean, she listened to actual proper ass honky motherfucker, that kind of rap music while she was cooking in the kitchen, and she had this tattoo on her thigh. Like, if you took one look at her, you'd instantly think, her dad must have never been around. Anyway, yeah, basically, draw a composite image of every modern woman, and you have someone like her. And I had issues with the two of them, mainly because they were the ones who I interacted with the most. Now, the thing about Jamie is I tried my best to get on well with him, and I think in the beginning he did the best he could, but he got annoyed with me over things that I thought were unreasonable. Like, if I would finish cleaning up my cooking utensils, my saucepans, whatever, I would leave them on the side of the sink, but I wouldn't put them away. He would get angry at me, and he would secretly tally all the times that I didn't clean up. And he made out to me, he talked to me a lot of times as though I was a regular culprit, like I did this often. But the weird thing about Jamie is that he himself, he was not exactly the tidiest of people either. And one noteworthy complaint I had about him is that whenever he would finish shitting in the bathroom, he would never clean up. Like, he wouldn't even flush. There was a great big trail of brown gravy in the toilet bowl, and I'd basically gotten used to it at that point. But you know, this is the thing about me. I don't know what it is about me, but I've learned from experiences. I've learned from past experiences with people like Jamie and Meg, and this isn't even the first time. You know, I had a similar experience the last time I went abroad. Is that for some reason I have a magnetic pull towards trouble when I live with other people. For some reason, I have these little quirks, these little personality traits that tend to anger and irritate people. And without meaning to, without intending to, other people can get annoyed with me. And this is one of the main reasons why, even though I might technically be eligible for council housing, if being in a council house means I'd have to live with other people, then I don't want that. Because I don't trust myself to not make enemies with other people. For some reason, they will find fault with things I do. They'll get angry at me for things that I'm not even aware of, whether they're reasonable or not. It just never works. You know, that is why if I ever get to the point where I can afford to buy a house and live in it, I would want to be the only one who lived in that house. Well, me, and theoretically, if I had a girlfriend or a wife, it would just be us and nobody else. Because whatever you think about me, whatever you've seen about me in this channel, if you actually lived with me, and I hate to tell you this, you would probably get annoyed with me over little things. And that might not even be your fault. It's just This is just who I am. I don't like to make trouble. I don't like to create conflict. And if there are issues with me, I try to just ignore them and hope that they will resolve themselves magically on their own. But that doesn't mean that conflict doesn't eventually find its way, doesn't eventually make itself known in front of me, because I just seem to have a talent. I have a knack for making trouble. Maybe a lot of it's down to the fact that I'm just bad at reading people, I'm bad at picking up signals, and I'm bad at understanding things like workplace politics, or just... I'm bad at picking up tells. Looking back, you know, there were many times when Jamie, his stupid white trashy girlfriend, and I ended up having arguments. They were quite silly. They were quite trivial. I would say that, looking back, you know, I did the best I could to placate him. I did the best I could to not annoy him. But a lot of the times I felt he was being deliberately unreasonable, and he was simply trying to be domineering and assertive. You know, he was trying to put himself in a position where he's the boss, and you got to do what I say because I'm the big sales rep. I make all this money, and I'm not like that. But for that reason, you know, I indulged him. I did as he said. I did clean up after myself in the kitchen, even though weirdly enough he himself didn't do this. You know, he had some kind of an ego problem, and I just had to put up with it. But looking back, would I say that I hate or resent Jamie? Well, not really. I just think it was kind of a mistake. It was a mistake that we had to be in the same house together. And would it have been an issue if I was living with other people? I want to say it wouldn't, but I'm not so sure. Perhaps I underestimate the depths of my own ignorance, my talent for making enemies out of potential friends. And at the end of the day, I guess by the time I finally left, I think we're on relatively good, decent-ish terms with each other. I've basically all but forgotten him and his trashy girlfriend now. Oh yeah, by the way, I don't really have any good things to say about his girlfriend, because she's a living, breathing example of everything that is wrong with modern women. Like, the only reason I didn't smack her in the face is because there are laws saying that you're not allowed to do that. But honestly, if somebody had smacked her in the face as a child, she'd probably be a lot more decent and sensible. But this is what happens when you raise girls without ever physically disciplining them. They end up like her. I think even Jamie deserves better, but whatever. Who am I to judge? Anyway, this video's gone on for quite a while, so in the next video, I'm probably going to talk about the nature of the job, what it was like, its ups and downs, and I'll take it up from there. Anyway, this has been Tracking. Hope you guys are having a great day. I'll see you later. Take care, everyone.